like and subscribe. Now, what family secret was finally spilled in your family? That my parents had to get married. They always told us they got married in 1961. But it was 1962, 3 months before my sister was born. What's amusing is that my father was an accountant who was insanely fast with math. Whenever he was asked how many years they'd been married, he'd be off by 1. My mother would correct him through clenched teeth and then my father would nod and agree. I was always told by an older relative of mine that the first child in a marriage for some reason always took less than 9 months. I always found it amusing to think about that. My great-grandmother wasn't actually Mexican but rather was adopted by a Mexican family from a Chinese family who was being kicked out of Mexico when railroad construction was over. She always had more typically Asian features but only spoke Spanish and it was never really questioned. 23andMe is a hell of a thing. When my paternal grandfather died, the federal government reached out to do a state funeral. He'd been career army and a colonel, so we didn't question it. Then the funeral came and they went all out. Huge procession. People showing up who are really big names, like heads of debts, senators, retired senators, people from the CIA and state debt. It was nuts and we were all super confused. Turns out he was a key dude in the OC during WWII, and when the OC splintered into the CIA and Secret Service, he went the Secret Service route. He wasn't on White House detail, but instead worked in a covert office that dealt with counterfeiting and currency. He went blind when I was a toddler and retired from the army. For whatever reason, he told no one about all his covert work with the OC and Secret Service, and the only person who knew, my grandmother, was sworn to secrecy and never told anyone. My father grew up thinking he was just a colonel working on base. Only after his death were we given all sorts of cool like publications by him, lectures given by him, and all kinds of things from various things he did and was known for. All I knew him as was a blind old man who was perpetually smoking, drinking and being a crotchety bastard. Turns out he was a bad moth affair and all, but none of us knew. In the 1970s, a dead girl was found on my grandpa's property. Everyone, including the local police, just assumed she was in with a bad crowd and murdered by drug dealers. In the 90s, some of his grandkids came forward about all the molestation. After that, people started to realize grandpa probably killed that girl. My mother is kid number 7 of 10. My aunt, kid number 4, who was born in 1945, did her DNA and found out that she has a different father from everyone else. She was devastated. There was always rumor that there was an affair but nobody talked about it. She has so many questions but nobody's alive to answer her. When I was 5 years old, 1988, Santa Claus left a Nintendo on our front porch. It was wrapped in newspaper, and my parents had no idea who gifted it to us. My dad, particularly, tried to figure it out. He was always suspicious that it had been a family friend. It was by far the best gift of the year, and we played it all the time throughout our childhood. My dad died in 2004, last Christmas. My mom explained that she was the one who had bought it and surreptitiously placed it on the porch. My dad really liked to be in control of things and had forbidden the purchase. She knew better. She didn't tell us all for 30 years. Thanks, Mom. My grandparents are first cousins. An uncle on the same side of the family is in prison for the assassination of a presidential candidate. Family still says he was framed and is innocent. I see a lot of stories about people finding out that who they thought was their parents weren't the people raising them, and this one is a little bit different. My dad always thought his father who raised him wasn't his biodad, and the father thought the same. He was treated terribly by his father because the father was told he couldn't have children, and my father was born prematurely, but at a healthy weight. So, everyone assumed my grandmother had an affair and got pregnant with my dad. It was to the point that after my grandmother died, my grandfather failed to even mention to his new wife that he had a son and grandchild, me. Years later, my dad gets an ancestry DNA test for him and me. He found out that his dad was actually his biodad. It was shocking and sad. Found out my grandma had a baby as a teenager and was forced to give him up for adoption by my great-grandparents. 40 years later he found us. Same thing happened to my mom. I'm 33 now. Older half-brother is roughly 35. I hold hope that I'll meet him one day. My cousin is actually my sister. Apparently my mom got pregnant really young and her much older sister adopted my sister and raised her as her own. It was actually an amazing moment when we found out my cousin, sister, and the sister I was raised with and I are really close. Just happened last year. We're all old now. I'm 50 and my cousin sister is 58. So it's just a really neat thing that makes us all happy. My de facto uncle. He and my aunt never married but have been together since well before I was born. With a few hiccups, has a child with another woman. It became common knowledge when the girl was 6 and was starting to understand the situation. At first it was a bit scandalous but she's been welcomed with open arms by my entire family, including her half-siblings' maternal grandparents. She's treated the same as all the other kids her age. Her half-sister, my cousin, has a daughter the same age and they are best friends. Go to the same high school. Totally inseparable. Technically aunt and niece haha. She comes to all our family events and she's an awesome kid. We're all stoked to have her in our family. After my mom died I found out the real story behind my parents' marriage. She came to my father's country to visit some of her relatives, met my father and after just 1 week she asked him to marry her so she could stay in the country. My father accepted because he had no one else and his parents were pressing him to get married already. But the highlight of the story is that over some time, the two of them fell in love with each other. Their love only grew over the time and they were really happy together. My mother spent her last days very ill, and she would accept only my father by her bedside. He swears to this day that she was an angel sent from God to take care of him. I am shocked that they got married just like that, out of the blue and ended up loving each other so deeply. I can only hope to have as good and loving marriage as they had. About a month ago, my mother-in-law's 88-year-old sister revealed on her deathbed that her husband's best friend was actually the father of all 4 of her children. Her husband was an abusive grade A jerk by all accounts. While everyone was shocked, no one was saddened by this news. My uncles are infamous criminals who killed multiple people. I thought they bred dogs. They may have also bred dogs. Lol. My mom's family, she always heard that her uncles were at Ohio State since she was a teenager and never learned until she was in her 30s that it was actually Ohio State Penitentiary because they were in the mob. My uncle served in Vietnam. While over there his troop found a baby that had been orphaned or abandoned. They aren't sure. My uncle was shipping back to Australia soon and wanted to adopt him. But my aunt said no. They'd only been married about 4 months when he was drafted. So while I don't agree with my aunt's actions and generally don't like her as a person, I can understand why she said no. My uncle's troop found a family to raise the baby, and that's the story the whole family knows. The secret is that my uncle and some other guys from his troop stayed in contact with the family and the kid, sending them money every month to help raise him and then to help him go to university, and eventually helped him and his adoptive family move to Australia in the last 90s. My aunt and the rest of my family had no idea all this time. It only came out when my aunt and uncle divorced in 2017 and she had a forensic accountant go through their bank records. She worked at a bank for like 40 years and always noticed the money missing. But his reasons were always justified. Since we all know now, my uncle has introduced some of us to the guy and his family. They are all really lovely people. We found out after my grandfather died that none of his 7 children with my grandmother were his, and that they all likely had different fathers. Nanny I had when I was younger was actually my dad's attempted sister wife. She found out how batchy was and dipped. My great-grandfather didn't die of cancer. He died from complications after being shot when one of his businesses was being robbed. Maybe. He also spent a lot of time in Atlantic City. He also had a lot of partners in the Teamsters and other unions in coal country. Also, everyone called him Smiling Tony, but his name wasn't Tony. He died in the 60s, long before my time. But when my great-grandmother died 20 years ago, a very old guy showed up to the funeral in a white suit and all of the oldest people in my family kisses his hand. When I asked, no one knew who he was. My grandfather moved his family away from Central PA in the late 60s and disconnected from all of this, but there it is. I was 35 when my mother finally admitted to me that she'd been lying about who my birth father was. She waited until after I'd reached out to his other children and we all thought we were siblings. He later confirmed I wasn't his. She refused to tell me who my biological father really was. My great-great-grandfather was exiled and banned from Missouri for being a sheep thief. I read an amusing anecdote here on Reddit a few days ago. In Europe, I want to say either Ireland or Wales, stealing a sheep was a capital crime. But shagging a sheep was just met with a lot of embarrassment. So if a sheep thief was caught out in the fields with no good explanation of what he was doing out there, it behoved him to pretend that he was a degenerate pervert rather than a thief. And that is why how the stereotype and jokes about sex with sheep came about. The penalty for livestock theft was to have your hand removed. The penalty for bestiality was to have a finger removed. Sheep thieves would claim buggery to lose only a finger instead of the wrist. Great-grandparents' 60th anniversary party at hotel ballroom with second cousins who hadn't seen each other in years. My mom and I were talking to my grandfather. Mom, wow, I haven't seen Chuck, Fred, and Claire in years. Me, no kidding. When do you think we'll get a group this big back together? Mom, Gramps' day is in 6 months. We'll see some people then. Me, 6 months? Isn't it his 60th? Or, Gramps, I never thought about that. My grandfather was 60 when he realized his parents had a shotgun wedding. We went to my grandmother's for Christmas dinner like we did every year, and my uncle drank too much and kind of hinted that he had an affair with my mother. A couple of months and 2 DNA tests later we found out my sister is actually his daughter. My dad never spoke to his brother again. And of course, my parents got divorced and I needed a lot of therapy and chocolate. Gosh, we are trash. After I was molested by my uncle, it came out he had done this to another one of my sisters and my family covered it up, particularly my mother. Now I know why my sister didn't like how close my uncle got to me when I was younger. It's never just one victim, which is why it's especially terrible to cover it up. This person isn't lying. I came out to my mom after the fact that a family friend had molested me and a brother of mine, and it turns out that he had did this to 4-5 children including me. So if you've been molested, I encouraged you to tell someone. BC, it's not just your sanity and safety at stake, but chances are it's someone close to you as well. I'm sorry this happened to you and your sister. I hope you are at peace now. Yes, we have bonded a lot more since this incident. The scars on her elder family member's wrist were not from a botched suicide. They were from her mom trying to protect herself and her kids from the approaching Red Army. That was at the end of WWII in Germany. This made it so much worse. My mom and older brother are not biologically related to me. My bio mom died sometime after I was born, leaving me, my sister, and my dad behind. My brother was the one that told me. My parents never told me because they wanted to protect me from the truth. But my brother thought that was a BS reason for me to not know. I don't know if my parents know that I know the truth, but I don't want to bring it up either. I met my wife when my daughter was 16 months old. Bio dad was never in the picture. Once it was looking like a relationship that would last. We got married and briefly toyed with the idea of just never telling her. She was around 3-4 at this time. Ultimately, we decided that it would be better to not hide it, though that has created some issues with her now half-siblings and some self-esteem issues. I just felt that her potentially finding this out as an adult might be pretty traumatizing and effed up. It's a pretty big life mission, and I just wasn't comfortable with it. Also as important, I believe, for medical history related things she'll encounter later in life. Lastly, it gives Bio Dad the chance to do an about face, perhaps as unlikely as that may be, and get to know his daughter without the massive trauma of an unspoken lie being brought into play. To ease into it, at around 4 years old, I started saying things to her like, after I met you and mommy, and this insert situation happened before I met you and mommy. She was able to put 2 and 2 together as time progressed, so it wouldn't have to be a sit-down confession, but rather a more evolutionary realization which we guided her through. That was a very thoughtful way to let her know the truth without trauma. That's a lot to carry, especially not bringing it up, probably to protect them. I'm glad you can speak to your brother about it at least. What if he was messing around and they are actually related? My grandmother recently died. She was famous in our town for her amazing cooking catering, in particular her turkey dinners. Notably, her gravy was absolutely amazing. So delicious. She had a heart attack several years ago and her near-death experience convinced her to share some of her secret recipes with me, all except for her gravy recipe. When she died this spring, I was going through her pantry and found an entire bucket of KFC gravy mix. She was literally using KFC gravy mix as a base to make her incredible gravy. Huge scandal. Mayo. Faking gravy has got to be the most charming family secret out of all the horrible shit in this thread. I remember reading about a similar scandal where the winning chili in a competition was nothing but 10 cans of Hormel chili and a jar of grape jelly. I have a friend who, several years ago, won a chili contest in his small town. His secret recipe? He bought a dozen bowls of chili from Wendy's, poured them all into a crock pot, and submitted the unaltered chili as his entry, where it won in a blind taste test. When my sister was diagnosed with cancer and her survival chances were low, it inevitably came out that she wasn't my sister. Parents must have felt we should all know the truth just in case. She survived her treatment, and will always be my sister. Was a bone marrow transplant in the cards? I feel like that's the most common reason to reveal that. You wouldn't test siblings for a match if they aren't genetically related. My mom cheating on my dad with my now stepfather. My parents divorced when I was really young, about 1 year old, so I don't remember anything about that. When I would ask as a curious kid why they split up, both said that they just fell out of love. I already had a feeling that this was not true because through my grandma I knew the divorce was in 1996. But my mom and stepfather started dating in 1995. On my 18th birthday my stepfather confessed to me in private that they had an affair all that time ago and he still feels awful, because he feels like he broke up that family. I told him that all is fine, because everyone is happy now and I already kinda knew it. Some years later my stepmother told me that my mom actually kicked out my dad without telling him why. She just needed a break. Remember, she just had a newborn and my dad could barely see me at the beginning. My dad later found out through the landlord that my stepfather had moved in the house my dad rented with his wife where his newborn daughter was living with a stranger. To this day I don't know how my dad managed to overcome this without starting a huge fight. I never talked with my parents about it. Just once when my mom was having a rant about a neighbor who left her husband for another man. I told her to stop throwing rocks while sitting in a glass house. I hope you know what this saying means. She definitely does. Found out my uncle is actually my brother. My mom had him when she was so young that my grandparents raised him. How old was your brother when he was your uncle? We aren't close so I don't know for sure, but he's at least 10 years older than me. It didn't seem weird because my mom is the oldest of her 9 siblings. How old were you when you found out? My mother is 17 years younger than the youngest of her 3 siblings and born about a year after that sibling started dating her husband. I am still waiting for this secret to come out. I have asked about it and my mother doesn't think so, but I still think there's an even chance. Could also not be the case. I am the youngest by 17 as well, and while most people thought I was my brother's child, there are pictures of my mom pregnant with me. This used to be a fairly common way to push things under the rug. Baby gets a good upbringing with family, mother gets her reputation intact. I grew up Mormon, and didn't connect the dots until I was an adult of the teenage girls I heard about or knew that moved to stay with family in Utah for a while. I mean, most of them probably did go to Utah, but it was to spend their pregnancy until they gave birth and the baby was taken for adoption. Same thing happened to Eric Clapton. He was raised thinking his mother was his sister, Jack Nicholson, as well. He didn't know about it until both his sister and mother had died, and while he said it was a bit shocking initially, he later expressed gratitude for having both women in his life the way they were. My grandma didn't drive. I thought she couldn't, but it was just never discussed. One day when I was maybe 7-8, I'd been trying to get anyone to drive me to the store for candy. We were visiting my aunt and uncle. Grandma lived with them. They had Bitter honey at the local store, which I could no longer get at home. But no one would take me to the store. Finally I said I'd just ask grandma, and my cousin chimes in with, "Grandma can't drive." "Oh, you bet your sweet I can drive. They just don't let me." Grandma had overheard and she was in high dudgeon, but that's all that was said about it. And my aunt finally took me to the store, so I forgot about it. Years later, when I'd just gotten my license, I asked my mom what was up with grandma not driving. She explained that during Prohibition grandma bootlegged alcohol for moonshiners. She was very successful at it. She was so successful at it that when the moonshiners were finally busted, even though the revenue was never caught, my grandma, her license was suspended by the state to never be reissued. Later in life she was told she could petition for it back, but it came with an admission of guilt or some such. She told them to go to hell. I love this story so much. Your grandma was an old timey badass. I knew an old man who, when he was a little kid, watched the bootleggers speed through their town as it was supposedly quite the exciting event for their small farming community. Little kids were probably watching your grandma race down the roads of their towns back in the day, too. She had a way about her, that's for damn sure. Cats hanging around your place and you can't get rid of them? Just rub their raw with a piece of corn cob and splash turpentine on it. That'll get them gone. Note: do not actually do this. Cruelty to animals laws have come a long way since the 1930s. Can't get rid of ducks you are eating in your garden? You get a piece of salt pork a few inches long, and you real tight tie some fishing line to it. Dangle it out there to the ducks, but give yourself 5 feet of line per duck. That first one will eat it, and it'll go through their system in minutes. By the time the hour is up, you'll have 6 ducks on a string and you can lead those bastards to someone else's garden. But my favorite memory was her sitting on a rocker on the front porch, wrapped in a shawl, chewing tobacco, and spitting off the edge to the flower bed. My uncle comes pulling up, gets out of the car, and he's white as a ghost. Everyone asks what's wrong, and he starts explaining that just as he topped the hill coming out of town there were 2 semi-trucks coming right at him in both lanes. He did the only thing he could do, and he skirted the ditch on the shoulder but managed to keep the car from going down into the bar ditch. Barely survived. Grandma huffs and says, "That's the difference between you and me. I'd hit that son of fab head on." Spit. Due to 23andMe, my dad learned that his recently deceased father was not his biological father. It wasn't a situation related to my grandma cheating either. It was a sperm donation. So, they knew this was the case his entire life. Pretty crazy they never told him. His parents did not pass until he was 65 years old. Talk about a curveball. Sperm donation was very secretive in the past. Sometimes even a secret from the perspective dad. BC there was such stigma around male infertility. I just commented elsewhere in this thread about something very similar. One of my friends did 23andMe and discovered she had 185 half siblings she didn't know about. The fertility doctor her mom had gone to was just using his own sperm and not telling anyone if a couple was having trouble conceiving because of the father. What's even crazier is that apparently he was not the only fertility doctor doing this. A couple of other superclusters of siblings have been found because of DNA testing. In most cases the parents had no idea this had happened until their kids got DNA testing done. This is years ago, and I only got a few rough details. But my baby mama's dad wound up getting caught in a sting trying to purchase a teenage girl. He had a separate apartment all set up, transferred the funds, and when he went to the delivery meet, was arrested by the feds. My dad fathered a child in high school. His side of the family knew. And my mom. We found out years after he died that we have a half sister. A buddy of mine met a girl at a bar. They totally hit it off. He told his parents about her and his dad took him outside and told him not to date her because she was his half sister. Okay, buckle up. I've recounted this story before, but this comment resonated. Here's how we found out. Dad got a girl pregnant and she decided to go it alone. She moved across the state and had my half sister. She met a guy, married, and he raised her like she was his own. They had no other children. She didn't reveal my dad's identity until after he died. Apparently, she contacted my grandma and mom, but they kept it from us. Years later, half-sister has a kid with medical issues and needs to know family medical history. She contacts mom and grandma, who, again, don't tell us. Meanwhile, after dad died, my uncle had prints made of a favorite picture of dad. He gets them framed and gives them to all us kids, as well as my grandma, aunts and uncles. Mom gets a picture to her half-sister after their secret meeting. Fast forward another few years. My brother and his roommate live in a nearby large city and hit a bar and pick up and bring home some ladies to sleep over. The next morning, my half-sister sees a photo of my dad on the mantle, turns white, and asks whose picture is that? That's my roommate's dad. He died a long time ago. I need to talk to your roommate. She lived her entire life across the state, hundreds of miles. Her friend was going to school in a large city near our hometown. She was visiting, and they decided to go to bar. They get picked up by my brother and his roommate. That's how we found out. My brother went to my grandma and asked about her, and grandma first denied it, then gave in and spilled the beans. Small world. Same. Met my half brother around 10 years ago. He's 10 years and 2 days older me and a great example of nature over nurture. He's exactly like us. Nature vs nurture is interesting to me. I have the opposite experience. Sort of. My daughter is not mine biologically, but I've raised her since she was 3 months old. She's going to be 13 this summer. The child walks, talks, and acts so much like me. My wife jokes that my genetics passed to her just by being around me. And it's too funny to see a stranger's reaction when she calls me dad, because I'm white as a ghost and she is black as night. Lol. I love that little brat to death. After my grandfather passed, we found out he had fathered a child when he was posted in Italy during WWII. He never knew. His mother intercepted any letters from the Italian girl. He came home, met and married my grandmother and had 4 children. I forget who in the family found out and how. It's crazy to think we have a whole Italian family out there. Imagine that Italian girl sending letters and believing someday a reply will come. Thinking about it makes me sad. My sister cheated on her husband throughout her entire marriage to the point that all 3 of her kids had different biological fathers. That's close to mine. Sister cheated on hers for 10 years. The guy she finally left her husband for was a PA involved with theft, sale of prescription meds, and ended up being the killer in a murder-suicide 2 years later with his co-conspirator. Each sentence was wilder than the next. That's like the reverse of Mama Mine. Papa someone else.